Okay, here's the wiring diagram for the rear window relay module in the first generation 4Runner. So there's two power feeds up here. See, pin 6 and 8. So pin 6 comes from this circuit breaker and the main 60 amp fusible link right off the battery. So that's constant 12 volts feeding pin 6. But all that does is feed the input contact to this relay. Now pin 8 comes from the ignition switch and the engine fuse. So you have to have the key in the ignition and it's got to be over in the run position. And then what that does, it comes down here, turns on this transistor, which then turns on this coil, which closes the contact on one of those relays. So you've got 4 relays in that window module. I'll come back to that in a little bit. So once you turn on the ignition switch, then you can come down here and you've got your 2 switches here. They call it the back door control switch. So that's the key switch in the tailgate. And then you've got the power window regulator switch. That's the one that's either in the center console or I have it on the dash. So this is the 2 switches I mentioned in the earlier video. There's all of these interlock switches. So everything on this rear window module is based on ground. You ground something to turn it on, you unground it to turn it off. Ground comes through there, it goes through these 2 switches, and if either one of those is open, if your door isn't locked, you can't operate the window, and if the cover top is, quote, not installed, you can't operate the window. Since everything's referenced to ground, rather than trying to trace the power from plus to minus, I'll just trace it from minus to plus because it's easier to follow. You've got the current flowing here, goes through this diode, and then over here through this relay coil, and then that goes over here, and this transistor comes over here, and that is fed from this rear wiper retraction detection switch, which basically tells you if the rear wiper is not on the glass. So that switch opens whenever the rear wiper is not sitting on the glass. And so that's another common problem that you'll run into with the rear window not working, is sometimes this switch is messed up. And I have a fix for that on the web page. You can check that out. But essentially when that switch is open, this transistor turns on, which then turns that transistor on, and then you can get power through this relay contact, through this coil, that turns the coil on, and then you have power that can flow through this normally open contact and down to the power window motor. And likewise, this is the down relay. If this relay closes, you get 12 volts here and the motor goes down. This relay's normally closed contacts are all hooked here to chassis ground. And I'll bring that back down. So this is ground on pin 10, and there's your normally closed contact is ground, and this normally closed is ground. So any relay that's off, you have ground, and any relay that's on, you have 12 volts. So let's go back. That's how the up and down work through the front switch. Yeah, if we look now at how this back door control switch is subtly different than the front power window regulator switch. And if you did the up, you would go through this diode, pull this side of the coil to ground, but this side up here is hooked to this transistor and it's off. So nothing's going to happen. You don't have power there. If you come up here, there's also another diode or another pair of diodes here that come up here and control the ground connection to this relay. The ignition switch turns this transistor on to turn on the relay, but the tailgate switch just turns it on directly. So as soon as you turn to up or down, this point here is connected to ground through one of these diodes, and that turns the relay on, and now you have power here. that'll turn on this relay, which powers up this whole module. And then you've got this same rear wiper retraction detection switch. If everything is in the right position, these transistors turn on, you have power here, and it turns on the coil. So that's why the rear key switch is different, because it turns on this relay when you use the switch. This switch relies on the key and the ignition to supply power to turn this on. Yeah, so that's one point, is looking at how these two switches are different. The other point is I was wanting to install a third switch in the back of the truck so that I could roll the rear window up and down from in back in the cargo bed, rather than having to climb through the front seats to get to the switch on the dash, which is kind of inconvenient. My two plans, one was just to wire a third switch in parallel here with 11 or 12, or pins 4 and 5. They're all jumpered together, as I showed you, and that would just add a third switch that could go up or down. And I knew that would work, but then one of the downsides of that is that relies on these relays here working. What I thought that might work was I could hook up to pins 1 and 3 here and have a direct connection to the motor, and then I could just put 12 volts and ground directly to the motor, and I could make the motor go up and down, and I wouldn't even need the relay module functional. In my initial glance at this relay module, I saw the 4 relays, and I just assumed that they were wired up in what's called an H bridge. So in an H bridge, you have 2 relays up here hooked up to plus 12 volts, and then you have 2 more relays down here hooked up to ground. So I assumed 4 relays was set up as an H bridge. The way it's set up, it's kind of an H bridge, but there's only 2 relays. And what you have is you've got ground on both sides of the motor, and then one of the connections goes to 12 volts to run the motor one way. The other relay turns on and puts 12 volts on the other side of the motor to go the other way. But when both relays are off, both sides of the motor are grounded. You can't send power to the motor because it's grounded on both sides. You basically just get a short circuit. I tried that, and it indeed does not work. The only way you can make that work is you've got to unplug the rear window module from the connector, and at that point you can connect to pins 1 and 3. So that's why you can't directly use 1 and 3 unless you're going to unplug the relay module. But at that point, the key switch and the dash switch aren't going to work. I guess the other thing you could do is you'd have to cut into the wiring harness and find pins 1 and 3, and then cut those wires, run them to a switch, so you could disconnect from the relay module and then connect to your manual switch. Like, I'm just trying to think of, like, hey, if I'm out in the middle of the desert, spending a week out there, and all of a sudden my rear window is stuck up or stuck down, what do? Because you can't roll it up. Direct control over the motor, and then when I get home, I can deal with soldering in some new relays and figuring out what went wrong. Anyway, I just thought I'd show you this schematic. A little bit confusing, but once I realized it's not a traditional 4 relay H bridge. I guess Toyota saved 2 relays by doing it this way. I guess it basically works, but it's like, if they would have just put in those extra 2 relays, it would have been so much easier. But anyway, I just thought I'd show you that. So yeah, check out the link to the web page in the video description. And if you have any questions, post up in the comments section below. And as always, thanks for watching.